Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs event. My name is Ken Broad, and I'm a longtime supporter with my wife, Jackie. And we're both delighted tonight to be sponsoring the program. Before we get started, a few reminders, all the usual stuff. First one is this is being recorded, so please make sure to silence your cell phones. Duration of our program. And if you have any questions for our guest speaker or the moderator, please fill them out. They'll be coming around and grabbing them. Or if you're viewing this online, you can put it in the chat that way. And for those of you in person here, everyone gets a copy of the book. I see there are already quite a few in the audience here, which is great. There's nothing that warms my heart more than seeing people with physical books, and Mike will be happy to sign them afterwards. We also have a wine reception afterwards as well. This is a reward for people coming out in person. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Mike Madrid is one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project and author, which will be described, I'm sure.
It goes either way, the audience.
Right. This is a friendly audience for the Lincoln Project. And author of the new book, which many of you have, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. I've read it, it's fantastic. Mike is the expert. Over his extensive political career, Mike has served as the senior advisor to both Republicans and Democrats and is one of the country's leading experts on Latino voters. So I think that's really one of the great things about you is you've represented both sides and a dual agent, if you will. He was also a spring 2019 fellow at USC Center for the Political Future, which is an organization that I've been involved with as well. In 2020, Latinos became the largest ethnic voting group in the country. Second largest, sorry. Mike's new book, The Latino Century, explores the historic rise and growth of Latino voters and why the two major political parties in the US have failed to understand and appeal to such a significant voting bloc. That's really important. Both sides have overlooked that group. Moderating tonight's program is Guy Marzorati, correspondent at KQED's California Politics and Government Desk. Please join me in welcoming both Mike and Guy.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ken. I'm delighted to be here with you, Mike. I think there's just so much in this book, The Latino Century, that really unpacks many of the key currents that are kind of shaping our electorate today and the 2024 election. But there's a lot, kind of up in the air right now about the 2024 election, starting at the top of the ticket. Yeah. You are, I think, at your heart, a numbers guy, a data guy. I think your Twitter bio says numbers and data for breakfast or something like that. Yeah. So if you're a numbers guy in the White House right now in the Biden campaign, what are the numbers you'd be looking at to determine the direction Democrats go from here, whether the president should remain at the top of the ticket?
It's a really big question, so I'll try to answer it as tightly as I can. I think to understand what is happening in the American political system today, it's most important to understand that the key driver is this idea of what we call negative partisanship. We all know what partisanship is. We all know what hyper-partisanship is. Negative partisanship is the idea that people are animated, passionately, and driven by what they're against as opposed to what they're for. And we can set aside a discussion on what that means for democracy, but what that really tells us is that the electorate is extraordinarily calcified. Republicans will vote for somebody who's as flawed as their candidate is, with going off on the litany of that, and Democrats are behaving the exact same way. They both view elections now as an existential threat to their worldview more than they view the strengths of their candidates. And so when you hear President Biden and his campaign team say, there's really been kind of a negligible effect regardless of this disastrous debate, the data is bearing that out. There's just been very, very little movement. And the question, I think, really becomes, incidentally, that same range would exist for whoever the Democratic nominee is. Okay, so it's not like it's a pro-Biden thing. It's just this is our champion at the moment. 75%, 83% say he's too old to be president, and they don't care. They know that. That's baked in. And the same is reversed on the other side. So when Biden says me staying the course is the best possible route, there's a very good argument for that. Because most of his negatives, his weaknesses are already baked in, as opposed to another candidate who hasn't been tested as much. But I keep in mind the delta, the differential is plus or minus 2 points either way. So there's a good case to be made for him staying. There's a good case for him to be made for him leaving. I'm of the opinion that you go with the, and I don't mean this literally, but you go with the devil that you know,
Yeah.
as opposed to what you don't know. There are very few things you can control in campaigns, very few. So you control as many variables as you possibly can to set yourself in the best course to win a race. And if I had to make the decision, I would say, we know what his weaknesses are. We know that he's going to make more fumbles. He is. There will be, and they may be considerable. The data tells us that will have a very negligible, if any, effect through the course of the campaign.
I think what concerns a lot of Democrats is the president had a base problem before the debate, right? That was a concern of bringing out the same coalition that elected him in 2020. And given the fact that, look, most candidates who are where he is right now in the polling do not go on to win. That's not always the case. I think George Bush came back from a summer deficit in 2004, but it would take a comeback that's somewhat out of the ordinary. Do you feel like ultimately, though, those Democrats come back home in this calcified environment? It's just those Democrats are going to get to the polls in November. How much of
the short answer is yes, but I want to unpack this question a little bit because it is really fascinating. At least I believe that it is. Joe Biden has consistently had very weak polling numbers with his own base. But on election days, we've had 50 primaries to test the theory of the case. He's overperformed the polling in about 47 of them. So, and that's the data point you have to pay attention to. It's telling us something. Donald Trump, his polling shows very secure, his base is intact, but he has dramatically underperformed in about 47 of them. To the point where he's losing 20% of base Republican vote against candidates that dropped out of the race 6 weeks ago,
yeah.
right? So that's a data point you have to pay attention to. And while you can't speculate too much on what that means, it cannot be ignored. And so when we're looking at performance of both party label and candidates and compare that to polling data, as they say in the military, if the map doesn't match the terrain, you follow the terrain because the terrain is real. The map is, it's a hypothetical drawing, and you've got to be able to look at, what is before you. And so I think, and again, I want to really qualify this because of what I just said in the previous answer. I was going to say, I think Biden and the fundamentals have him in a very strong position. Let me rephrase that by saying he's not in as weak a position as people think he is. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I'm assessing the race and looking at it is Biden has a polling problem that doesn't manifest at the election booth. Trump has an election day problem that is not manifesting in the polling.
I think regardless of who's at the top of the ticket for the Democrats, there are a couple of really fascinating trends that will decide this election. And your work and this book are really kind of at the center of both. One is this shift of suburban voters, in many cases women, away from Republicans towards the Democratic Party. It's the type of voters that you targeted working on the Lincoln Project. The other trend is this move of blue-collar voters. And when we talk about blue-collar voters, increasingly we're talking about Latino voters moving towards Republicans. So how do you see those two trends kind of intersecting, converging as we move towards November?
I love that question because for whatever peculiar reason in the cosmos, I have an expertise in both of those. Like those are my two main demographics, and those are the two that are moving at this moment in time in this extremely calcified environment, this extremely calcified political, hyper-partisanized environment. The only two measurable voter groups that are moving are college-educated white voters, largely independents and Republicans, not a lot of Republicans, but enough to measure. And they're moving and have been moving since 2016 to the left. And what's fascinating as a Republican who's been working with Republican voter groups for 3 decades, is they're moving for cultural reasons. We used to close Republicans and bring them home on election day on tax cuts and regulation and free market messaging, that kind of classic conservative stuff. And a lot of times we would find specifically women who would be like, well, I'm pro-choice, I support the right to choose, it's a pro-life party, I'm not really comfortable with it, but, tax cuts, come on, tax cuts. And they'd come back home and support tax cuts. That changed. In 2020, we doubled down with the Lincoln Project exclusively. You never saw a tax cut ad from us. It was all culture. It's culture, 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 because we were shaking those college-educated women off. And it wasn't just women, but it was largely women. But the exact reverse is happening with the working class as the education divide, as we call it, reshapes the contours of the country. Those with a college degree are rapidly consolidating under the Democratic Party's banner. Those without a college degree are equally as rapidly consolidating under the Republican banner. And this divide is getting bigger, and it's manifesting not just in terms of an economic divide, although that's true, it's really a culture divide. It's a perspective, it's a worldview divide, and Latinos, to your point, are moving, and I want to be very careful on how I say this, are increasingly not voting with the Democratic Party. There are two things I did not say. I did not say that they are increasingly compelled to move to the Republican Party because of those issues, although there is some truth to that. But more importantly, I did not say that they are shifting to the right or realigning to the right. And I want this to be driven home really, really clearly. The reason I am not saying that is because what we are witnessing is the emergence of an entirely new electorate. A realignment presupposes that there's a vote history or a pattern of voting one way and changing that alignment. 38% of Latino voters are 30 years of age or younger. So they don't have that vote history. They are emerging as a more populist, especially with economic and political populism, that is more apparent and more attractive on what we would call the American right. And I'm getting uncomfortable on how I phrase this a little bit because I don't believe that the right-left spectrum exists much anymore. I believe we are in a very populist moment where the establishment is kind of crumbling along with the institutions. We're watching that in the Democratic Party right now. And the rise of populist sentiment amongst key voting groups, particularly working class folks, is dominating our discourse. 60% of voters don't have a college degree, so there's more fish in that barrel, and they're increasingly Latino. Sorry about the long answer, the nerdy answer, apologize. But that's essentially what is happening. And as Latinos become the fastest growing group of the working class, the challenge for Democrats particularly isn't losing white voters in the Rust Belt, right? The economic anxiety voters. Their saviors are not going to be Gretchen Whitmer or Tim Ryan or Amy Klobuchar, although that's where DC is looking. Their saviors will be Ruben Gallego, Catherine Cortez Masto, and Alex Padilla in the Sun Belt in the Southwest.
To flip that dynamic the other way then, does the question become for Donald Trump, can he gain more of those working class voters than he's losing in the suburbs?
You just asked the question of who's going to be the next president of the United States. And in fact, Tim Alberta just wrote a piece in The Atlantic on this yesterday where LaCivita and Susan Wiles, the two co-campaign managers for Trump, were exploring just that topic. Just the fact that they're seeing the race that way tells me they have a decided advantage. Because the Democrats right now are more worried about putting George Clooney in the New York Times telling the president to get out while they're actually looking at demographics and math, and the Democrats are looking at something entirely different. But to answer the question, the Democrats believe that they can, I believe because of the overperformance we were talking about at the polling, because of the performance post-Dobbs in lower turnout elections, and because the Democrats also believe, I think, that the propensity of U.S.-born Hispanic men specifically is not significant enough to surpass what they think they can peel off. The Trump campaign actually believes the opposite, and that's where the fight's going to be.
We're going to get back to a lot of this 2024 and trends, but I want to talk a little bit about your journey in politics, which you lay out in this book. You grew up in Ventura County, home of the Reagan Library.
Home of the Reagan Library.
How did that kind of shape your worldview, your political view growing up?
Yeah, I grew up in a home of lower income Latino, Mexican American Catholics, and was kind of imbued with that sense of the world. In many ways, it was not unlike the trajectory of a lot of ethnic Catholics at the turn of the last century through Ellis Island. But we were imbued with a very strong sense of looking out for the least among us and having an obligation to the poor, and dedicating our lives to doing that. And politics became, my parents were not politically involved, but they were very politically aware. And so very robust political discussions were part of that conversation. And the more I listened to my father, he didn't sound like a Democrat to me. and I would point that out, as a young son sometimes does. And
Under
that,
your breath, or?
yeah, well, no, pretty directly. And it made dessert time tough, because by the time we got there, the conversations were pretty heated. But that was encouraged in my family. And to me, Moorpark, I'm from a little town called Moorpark. Moorpark had a really curious distinction. It's a little city right in the middle of Ventura County. My family moved there in '71. The population was about 2,500, 3,000 people. By the time I graduated from high school, it was about a little shy of 40,000. So it was one of the fastest growing communities in Southern California at the time. This is 1980s, Reagan, defense spending, the economy is going fantastic. But it had one very curious distinction. It was the only city in California that had a declining Latino population. The small little Mexican agricultural family that I was in was kind of being swallowed up by suburban McMansions growing up around it, while around that, California was becoming more Latino. So I had to really learn how to navigate my private life with my friends and settings with the broader construct of California. I think it made me a better political consultant, but the lasting image, I think, in my mind is, the name Moorpark is a type of apricot, because we had apricot orchards around us. And I remember the field workers coming in, seasonal field workers, and right above those field workers were the horizon where the Reagan Library was built in my senior year of high school. So both of those I was very comfortable in both of those. I was actually asked to speak at the Reagan Library on this book on October 8th.
Okay.
So it's a real homecoming for me, because I feel as natural and comfortable there as I do amongst field workers. Yeah. To me, it's natural. Although politically, it seems kind of diametrically opposed. It actually makes perfect sense to me.
It strikes me that you're a contemporary of what we in California politics know as the Prop 187 generation. A lot of the leading Latinos in our state politics, Alex Padilla, John Perez, Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher, they came up around this campaign of, opposing a ballot measure would have restricted public benefits for undocumented immigrants. What was your experience in that moment?
That's a great question, because I was actually an undergraduate student who went to Georgetown University right after the primary. So I wasn't actually here, but I was reading about it in the paper, literally, because this was kind of pre-internet, right? So I would literally get the Washington Post and try to read about what was going on back home, and call friends, pay long distance rates on my landline, and try to understand what was happening. Now, I had done a campaign in 1992 for a real kind of fire breather, a Republican congressman by the name of Elton Gallegly. And Elton was one of the first really strong anti-immigrant crusaders. He and like Dana Rohrabacher and B1 Bob Dornan. And yeah, truly. And so I was kind of steeped in how powerful the immigration issue was, how visceral it is to people from an identity perspective, and how threatening it all is and can be. And I think at that moment, understanding that dichotomy inside of me, the Reagan Library, the field worker, and this issue, and how explosive it was, I was like, I gotta do this for a living. Like, this is like fascinating. But one of the things, more to the point of your question, and everybody that you mentioned there, they're all dear friends, which is interesting, because even though I'm a Republican, they knew that my primary concern was for the community. And even though we disagree on a lot of issues, Alex Padilla will call me and say, "Mike, I need to talk to you about something." Antonio Villaraigosa asked me to run his governor's race. Lorena Gonzalez and I will fight about union issues all day long, because we don't see eye to eye on those issues at all. But one thing I did notice, and this really became an impetus for the way I started to target voters, I was the grandson of immigrants. I am the grandson of immigrants, with a very strong affinity for my Americanness and for my Latino identity. Nearly everybody who was politicized and driven to action by that issue was the son or daughter of immigrants, almost every one of them. And that difference left a very profound mark on the way I understood the politicization process. And it became really foundational for this book, for this work, because the rapid explosion of what we're seeing in the Latino voter now is third and fourth generation, now fourth generation voters. Like I'm in my early 50s. And now there's a discernible fourth generation of Latinos, which that age cohort didn't exist when the past 30 years. We couldn't test that or focus group it or pull it. And it's 180 degrees different than the first and second generation voter. So again, my lived experience, paying attention to what I was feeling, I was seeing, what I was experiencing, compared to the Latino sort of political establishment, couldn't have been more divergent. And one of the great things about having most of these folks as friends is I could, from a data perspective, explain why what they were doing politically was wrong. And they would kind of nod and say, okay, but continue to do what they were doing because they were acting rationally as politicians. My job is not as a politician. Mine is more, I see it as to kind of explain some of what's going on. Theirs was to actually survive in getting the votes to keep moving their career forward.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as a pejorative.
Yeah.
That's their job.
You kind of rose up through the ranks in the state Republican Party.
Yeah.
What did you feel like? So this was, throughout the 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
What do you feel like you were bringing to the party during those times? What did you take from that experience, those years?
Boy, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I really had to use my skills of navigating sort of my Latino expertise in a non-Latino world. I was a political director at 26 years old. But I was getting regular threats to go back to the country where I came from my own party, daily. I mean, just constant. And every time my name would appear on an immigration issue, there would always be some sort of fracas at the Republican Party headquarters because base Republican voters were like, who is this guy? Why is he the one talking on behalf of Republicans? He's not even an American.
I think your first campaign boss thought you were a spy.
Yeah, my first campaign boss thought I was a spy because this was early in voter data history. They're like, how can a Mexican-American kid with a Spanish surname in a family of Democrats be a Republican? Because I knew I was a Republican. I registered Republican on my 18th birthday. I couldn't wait to register. I knew. I was that weird kid, right? I guess. But it made perfect sense to me. But these were the early days of voter data where you could look that stuff up. And so they thought I was a spy. And so and there are spies in campaigns, by the way, that does happen. Of course, I had no idea. So I walked in and wanted to volunteer for my congressman. And they were like, why would a Mexican kid from a Democratic family want to work for a congressman who's pretty anti-illegal immigration? Like, what's going on? And my first job in politics was to take off stamps from envelopes that had been misstamped.
They wanted to make sure.
I, of course, had no idea. I thought I was saving the republic, right? So I'm peeling stamps off, and they put me in a storage closet, isolated me from everybody. And I would be there for hours just in trying to peel them off perfectly so that the congressman could use them again. And after hours and hours and hours of doing it, they just realized he's not a spy, he's just a weird kid. So that was my first job in politics. And that was where I learned I was so committed and wanted to help the congressman out. And they ended up offering me a job, and I was kind of on my way in Republican politics.
When you were thinking about in those days, putting the coalition together to win these campaigns, I mean, that kind of nativist undercurrent was always, Pat Buchanan, so much of what he was saying.
Yeah.
From what I'd say. So was that something you were thinking of, okay, we need to have these people in the tent to win the election? Or how were you thinking about that, I guess, at that time?
I'm not going to say I wasn't uncomfortable with it, but I'm also not going to say it was very clean to me, because what I will say is this, and I want to be very methodical in how I pick my words here. The America First stuff was very strongly, not entirely, but very strongly imbued with a sense of nativism. There was clearly a blood and soil component to it. You could see it at conventions. Yeah. And there was a lot of really nasty, ugly anti-Mexican stuff, specifically in the 1990s, when I was a political director that was making its way through convention halls at the time. But I also very much subscribed to the idea that a lot of what I was hearing on the left was equally racially charged. And what I could never reconcile was why some of it was okay on the left if it's not on the right. Isn't it equally bad, and what does that mean? And I think through the course of my journey in politics, what I came to understand was we will probably as a species never completely overcome that. And so we've got to be somewhat situational with it. And I don't know if that's right or if that's wrong. I just know that that's where I'm at now. And recognizing that when there are inequities that are so obvious, that are so disparate, we can't just say, well, we got to be a colorblind society. We have to do something as a community to reconcile it. Even if they're temporary and run their course, and maybe something works during the 70s and the 80s, but no longer applies now, we have to be sophisticated enough as a society and as a culture to be okay with that. Because if we don't, we're not self-reflective enough to address some of the very deep-seated, I don't even know what the right word is, but just the deep-seated flaw in the American story. And I think as I've gotten older, maybe it's because of life experiences, I'm much more comfortable looking at America and loving her more because she's flawed, not despite those flaws, because it reminds me, I guess, of my own journey, is we all have our scars. And we become a better person if we acknowledge it and make a commitment to be better, not to just pretend it never existed or just don't look at it.
But when Donald Trump came down that elevator in 2015,
Speaking of ugly scars.
you didn't see that as something just to ride out. You were pretty early in
that was a
making...
breaking point, and it had been emerging for a while for me. Because, look, a lot of people, the universality of classic conservatism, as I call it now, I still have a deep, passionate love for that. When I heard Jack Kemp speak about policies that addressed the poor, that spoke to that Mexican Catholic poor kid in me, where I could dedicate my life, and there was somebody who cared about it, that talked about ownership and the human spirit and the value of lifting up all boats. Like I didn't just believe that, I passionately committed my life to it. And that, sorry, I kind of went down that rabbit hole there because that's what still drives me, is whether, and I'm not particularly, committed to policy on one side or the other. To me, is if somebody is hungry, you can feed them now without saying, well, you're hurting this person. We can talk about a longer term policy solution. But I guess what I'm saying is, the Republican Party changed, and I know exactly the moment of when it changed from the universality of conservatism, where it was really, I believe, trying desperately to hold true to the creed that we are all endowed by our Creator, or when Reagan gave the City on a Hill speech, which was foundationally an immigration speech. The Republicans always stop that speech when he says, "Windswept and God blessed." The next sentence in that speech is where he says, "And if there must be a wall, it must have a great gate that can be opened to all who want to come here." That is an enormously confident statement about our values.
That moving in the darkness toward home, yeah.
And what it says is not just that we're a beacon, but that those beliefs spread by our commitment to them. It's literally the same sentiment as Lincoln's right makes might speech at Cooper Union that started the Republican Party. And there's an arc between Lincoln and Reaganism. It ends on 9/11. And I worked on George Bush's campaigns. And the promise of what George W. Bush was doing with being very pro-immigration, pro-Hispanic, pro-diversity, if you will, I guess in today's parlance, was that confidence in the universality. On 9/11, the administration changed, the party changed, and the country changed. And you saw that stuff that was Pat Buchanan back in the dark corners of conventions become the dominant isolationist, protectionist, nativist. And that's not conservatism as I know it. So I reject the idea that there's, populist conservatism. Those are two diametrically opposed ideologies. It's like being a Dodgers and a Giants fan. You can't do it, right? You want to think you can, but you really can't.
So this became a driving force for you and other conservatives to start the Lincoln Project, which you worked on in 2020. Talk about your work on that and this idea of the Bannon line.
Yeah. So, I got a call from Reed Galen, one of the 8 members, who said, "Hey, Mike, you've been very vocal critic and unwavering, and you're kind of fearless," because they knew, rightfully, that if we spoke out, that we would be mercilessly attacked, including threats to our family, to my children, attacks on everything from my technology to my business, just massive, massive impacts. Because the thing about Trumpism, and I'll just generally call it that, is where when I was growing up, the main inviolable characteristic of republicanism was raising taxes. You just couldn't do that. Now, today, it's you must demonstrate fealty to the leader. Whatever Donald Trump says is the orthodoxy, and we all follow it. And that's nothing like Republican or conservatism that I knew, but they knew that in order to enact discipline, that fear is the tactic that they use. So we knew that we were going to be made an example of. And that, of course, happened. All of that happened. But there were 8 of us. Most of us were political consultants. George Conway, who's become a dear friend, is an attorney by trade, but with remarkable political instincts. And we launched in December of 2019. This was right at the beginning of the first impeachment hearing. And what we realized was the Republican senators were not going to allow evidence to be heard in the Senate. And the evidence, of course, was overwhelming and damning. I mean, the president's voice was literally on the phone shaking down Zelensky. There it is. And so the Republicans were like, we're not going to allow that into the impeachment hearing. And we realized that's how corrupted the whole system had become. And we, at some point, political consultants became the moral backbone of the Republican Party, so that was us. And so we took the fights to him, and we expected, I think, to raise $5-6 million maybe, play in a couple of states. We ended up raising about $100 million, and it was probably the most successful PAC in American history, and tipped into pop culture, and we were I think very consequential in the outcome of that race. But
you had really modest aims. I mean, I think you seemed like you approached it in terms of...
Well, I do data work. And again, so much about politics is about emotion. And I think that's why I love it, is because it's just so right now with the president, everyone's lighting their hair on fire and running in circles and rolling on the ground and wailing and teeth gnashing and, oh my God, what's going to happen? And you show them the data, and it's the differential of what's going to happen is marginal. And I think I learned that in campaigns, the person who's the most confident in control has the most knowledge of what is actually happening with voter behavior. And I think it just naturally made me a little bit calmer. And so I developed what I called the Bannon line, named after Steve Bannon. And to show you kind of how campaigns work a little bit is, the expectations for the Lincoln Project were getting really out of control. People were like, are you going to start a new party? And can you run a new candidate against them? And can you get 50%? And I was like, this is not how this works. And Steve Bannon in the New York Times had said, if we lose 5 to 7% of the Republican base, we're going to lose. And so I called my political team together and I said, I want a press release to go out now, and I want every one of the members on their Twitter feed to call this the Bannon line. And I want Madrid out there saying, That's me, by the way, talking to myself in the third person. I want to get as much exposure with me saying that is the line, and if we move just 5 to 7%, we're going to win. And I called it the Bannon line because I didn't want to say it's a bunch of Lincoln Project Republicans. Steve Bannon said it's true. And so that, of course, took off and became a big thing. And Steve Bannon and I started fighting back and forth because, he said, you're an old school rhino, which I took as a great compliment. Still want to get a T-shirt that says old school rhino on it. And he correctly, and again, I hate to say, how there's sometimes you can just really, you're on the same wavelength as somebody on the opposite side of a campaign. It happens. That's where Steve Bannon and I were. And I'm not proud of that, but I knew that when I called it the Bannon line, it was a reference to the Mendoza line in baseball. And Bannon went and referred to it as the Mendoza line. They're calling it the Bannon line. So he knew I was thinking what he was thinking, and he knew what I was thinking.
They call that rent-free.
Rent-free in each other's head. And there's a great scene there's a documentary made about all this where I said, I'm living rent-free in Steve Bannon's brain and his head. And he went out and did a press conference when he called me an old school rhino. And it was the day before he was arrested on the yacht of the Chinese billionaire. So it's a great scene in the documentary if you haven't seen it yet.
What's the Bannon line this year? Is it higher?
Well, that's a great question because there isn't one. First, because it's not the same race. And because of the shifting dynamics with Latinos and with Republicans moving in the other direction, you can't impart that. One. Two is I can't say it's a Bannon line until Bannon says it's the Bannon line. So he's going to have to agree first, right? I mean, technically. I guess I could just kind of take that sort of branding and make it up. But what I will say is this. I believe, at least I did before the debate, I believe the potential for Biden or any generic Democrat to get 10% of Republicans to move over was very possible, which would be, it wouldn't be quite landslide territory, but pretty close. One of the shifts that we saw after the debate, we saw 3 shifts. This is, I think most people are fascinating, and this is largely taken from the New York Times poll that showed Biden slipping 6 points behind. Biden actually has increased his vote share with independents after the debate, okay? But he's losing because a lot of Democrats got weak-kneed, as you're seeing and hearing every day, and have moved not to Trump, but off of Biden. That's very correctable. That will come back. The other part, though, is the Republicans started to consolidate, where there were Republicans who were like, I don't think I can do Trump again. Maybe Biden's not so bad. The economy is getting better. Inflation is under control. I don't really like it, but this January 6th stuff scares the hell out of me. I think I might be voting for Biden. That all went away at the debate. The Republicans went right back. And so Republicans consolidated earlier than I would expect. Democrats are shakier than they will be in a couple of weeks. And independents moved towards Biden, not by the numbers he needs, but in the right direction. And that's why I'm saying the fundamentals still look, the movement is marginal, but the directions of each of those 3 categories are heading in the right direction, at least at the moment.
You talk about the consolidation, and I do feel like that's just, we zoom out to the 20, 30 years. That is a trend we're looking at where there just aren't the liberal Rockefeller Republicans, there aren't the conservative Democrats we used to see. I mean, when you're looking, and in this book you explore a lot this trend of the Latino vote, to what extent are any gains that Republicans are making with Latinos simply a product of Republicans consolidating conservatives?
I don't believe that the movement of Latinos to the Republican Party is part of a broader conservative movement. I believe that the movement of Latinos to Republicans is part of a much bigger populist movement. And it is anti-establishment. And here's one of the things I really try to bring out in the book is one of the things that's happening in this country right now is a crisis in our institutions. They're collapsing. And it's broad, whether it's the media, government, churches, the military, corporations, academia. These are all, they're all collapsing. The trust and confidence of the people that they exist to serve doesn't really exist. There's one great exception, and that is Latinos. Latinos have this very high level of trust and confidence in these institutions that make society generally work, but democracy, American democracy is anyway, specifically work. But there are two exceptions. The two exceptions are the Democratic and Republican Party. The Latinos have the weakest partisan anchor of any race or ethnicity. We have the highest likelihood of disaffiliating from both major parties. We have some of the lowest turnout rates, some of which I would argue is a function of poverty levels, but for those that it's not, it's a disaffiliation from the parties because neither one is selling what they want to buy. And you also have seen, for example, the two American politicians who overperformed significantly above conventional wisdom and data and polling were Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And I think that the most anti-establishment candidate in the race today is clearly Donald Trump, which I think is part of his appeal. I will say one other thing about that, which is somewhat of a qualifier. If you look at Ron DeSantis in Florida, Greg Abbott in Texas, Doug Ducey, the former Republican governor of Arizona, even Brian Dahle here in California, the kind of sacrificial lamb that ran against Gavin Newsom, they have one thing in common. They all met or considerably exceeded Trump's numbers with Hispanic voters. In every single competitive House seat in the country, the Republican candidate overperformed Donald Trump with Hispanic voters. That is very strong evidence that Donald Trump is not bringing Latinos to the party. He is limiting much further natural growth that would be happening because of the assimilative and economic factors that I talk about in the book. So if Trump was not on the ballot, any other Republican would be doing considerably better than Trump in the polls right now, at least as much as can be with a highly negatively charged environment. But they would be doing much better demographically in states like Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania.
Well, let's talk about one of the places where that's happening, and that's the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. You devote a whole chapter in the book to the trends happening there. I mean, is that a place that you see as some sort of kind of canary in the coal mine, maybe?
No, I don't. I mean, what I was trying to do, and I talk about North Carolina, I talk about Arizona and Nevada, and you have to talk about the Rio Grande Valley because it's actually quite exceptional. The Rio Grande Valley is very rural, and it's very multi-generational, and by that I mean people in the Rio Grande Valley are not generally newcomers. Texan Hispanics have been there for oftentimes many hundreds of years. And you have seen some of the most significant shifts to the right, in large part because of their demand for stronger border security. Yeah. And that was why I wanted to put that in there, is because that exists. When I was doing focus groups for Antonio Villaraigosa's gubernatorial campaign, I remember sitting in Fresno and Bakersfield and bringing in Latino voters who were immigrants themselves. All legal at the time, but two or three of them in the group had come undocumented years ago and then left and then come back to legal means. And at least 35, 40% of them were like, no more migrants, no more legal migrants, let alone undocumented migrants. And that sentiment, 30% of Latinos voted for Proposition 187. So that sentiment is very keenly there. It's greater now because of the assimilation that I'm talking about, this third generation voter. When Joe Biden signed the executive order on asylum, restricting asylum refugees, 69% of Latinos supported it. That's compared to 70% of all Americans. So there's basically no discernible difference. And after 30 years of watching these immigration fights back and forth, it's become very clear to me that the Democrats have lost that battle. And what I will argue, because I had a front row seat on both sides of this thing, both parties have benefited politically from a broken immigration system, both of them. The Democrats have tried to use it as a way to mobilize Latino voters to turn out by demonizing Republicans. The Republicans have made it very easy to be demons. But the Republicans, of course, have used it to turn out their white, non-college educated base and overperform. But as long as that problem exists, they've got a political base, which is in large part why the Republicans walked away from the deal that they crafted earlier this year. They weren't about to give that up because they're like, well, wait a second. Yeah, it's like, Arafat negotiating peace. Once you give him everything he wants, he's like, oh, no, I didn't really mean it. Like, I'm out of here, right? I don't exist unless there's conflict. And that's what the Republicans did earlier this year.
Well, I was thinking, reading that chapter in the Rio Grande Valley, I thought about Imperial County here in California.
Yeah.
I spent some time there a few years ago because that was the biggest 2016 to 2020 pro-Trump shift in the state.
Yes.
And there you have a border community that views the border not just in terms of a cultural issue, but it's a jobs issue, right?
Correct.
So many people are working
Correct.
in their border patrol. And you have, in my mind, I saw just a real absence of Democratic presence. Even the media market there was the Yuma, Arizona
Correct.
media market. So, I mean, to what degree are maybe these case studies in whether it's Calexico or the Rio Grande Valley, a place where Democrats are kind of just ceding ground? They're not on the playing field.
It's a great way to put it, and that's the right word. And I would take it a step further. No journalist, this is a tip for you, no journalist yet has written the Central Valley of California and the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. These are both very similar. Now, one's not on the border, Central Valley, but these are oil-producing agricultural communities in rural red parts of the country. Those shifts are happening there for largely the same reasons. So, but the word ceding ground is exactly right. Like when I watch what the Democrats' messaging is with Latinos right now, it's clear to me they're either completely, totally, grossly incompetent, or they're just ceding the ground. And doubling down on Dobbs and abortion and focusing more on the college-educated shift that's already happening, which is not a bad strategy. I mean, I think it's unnecessary, but that's what seems to be they're doing, because I can't figure out what the hell they're doing.
Well, I think in some case, I would say, Democrats, and maybe you think that they've overlearned the lesson, but you see these examples of whether it's Prop 187, the, SB, whatever it was in Arizona, 1070, even Trump's rhetoric in 2016, that the identity concerns for Latinos suddenly get spiked. Is that a sugar high for
attack? Yeah, but understand, and this is kind of my point, the point of the book, is that works remarkably well when the dominant part of the Latino community is an immigrant. When they're the grandchildren of immigrants, more often than not, those grandchildren are on the side of those pushing for more border security. That's the big change. And this moment, this year, the reason I wanted the book out this year is the next 30 years of Latino politicians and politics is going to be 180 degrees different than the last 30 years of Latino politicians and Latino politics. That's the book. That's the Latino century. And it's that nexus as both parties struggle to identify what it means to be a minority when Latinos aren't behaving like minorities are supposed to behave, right? Like, what does that mean? And what does that struggle mean for the parties when they don't know exactly what to do? Let me characterize it like this. The party that's able to secure the hearts and minds and ultimately the votes of a multi-ethnic working class voter group will be the dominant party of the next generation. The Democratic Party still hasn't realized it's not a working class party anymore. In fact, the Democratic Party, get this, the Democratic Party is less diverse racially and ethnically now than at any time since before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's becoming wealthier, whiter, more progressive, because the Democratic Party is animated almost entirely by cultural issues now. These are voters that are not impacted by the price of gas or a carton of eggs. They don't even know what that means anymore. But they'll fight, they'll fight, on Dobbs and gun control and marriage equality, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they're increasingly removed from their working class base. That is like, I need to pay rent on Friday. Like, I got to get my kids sign up for a soccer league. I don't know if we can make that work. And the Republican Party has been good on the working class piece, but they've struggled with the multi-ethnic piece. What they're the beneficiary of is this third and fourth generation Latino voter that is driven more by economics than by their racial or ethnic lens, because they don't feel that different. They're not that different. And so that's why this, and again, it's not a shift, it's an emergence, because these are all young voters, by the way. These are not old Democrats that are like, I don't think I'm with the Democrats anymore. These are all a massively huge number. 2 million, It's 4 million new Latino voters will be on the voter rolls compared to 4 years ago. That is crazy. And it's going to start growing exponentially after that. So all of this growth, and 80% of it is US born. Like, you can't build a wall to stop it anymore. It's already happened, right? These are the grandkids and great-grandkids of immigrants.
I think Democrats in places like Nevada, places like California would say the antidote to the degree divide that you're talking about is organized labor. To what extent do you think that's a scalable solution for Democrats to lean into unions, which provide not only kind of a working class agenda, but also an identity?
Well, it's worked in Nevada, but Nevada is the size of like San Mateo County, right? And it's
arguably more fun.
Oh yeah, well, a lot more fun. Sorry, but like Nevada is determined by Clark County and the Culinary Workers Union, which Harry Reid kind of built up. And there was early tension because they didn't want a lot of these Latinos in the union, which is not uncommon with unions. They don't want immigrants specifically because they drive down the price of labor and competition. But once they accepted that, over half of the culinary union now is Latino, and I talk about this in the book, and it has brought them pretty consistent gains since the Harry Reid era, and it has made what should demographically be kind of a Republican state. I don't want to say reliably Democratic, because Nevada is the one swing state that is moving more Republican. All the others demographically have been moving towards a more bluer position. Nevada has actually, for the past 3 election cycles, become more Republican, and so they're holding on to it by margins. But let's talk about unions generally really quickly. Latinos have the lowest unionization rate of any of the race or ethnic groups too. And so it's not that there's like a culture of labor. We're also the most likely to work in the gig economy. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying it's a matter of survival. So there's not that natural proclivity for it. And for labor to catch up to actually make it a force, I think is probably not the right solution, because I'm just not convinced, as I tell my friend Lorena Gonzalez, who's the head of the AFL-CIO in the state, unionization from a data perspective, no offense, it's a last century solution to a new century's problem. You can't organize your way out of the challenges that working class people are experiencing anymore. The economy doesn't work that way. Our industries don't work that way. So I mean, in some small selected markets, Nevada being one of them, it does work for the time being. California, I would say, the most pro-union state probably in the country, has a real problem with turning Latinos out. And we've got one of the lowest unionization rates of any race or ethnic group in the state and country.
I want to get into some of these great questions that we got from the audience. One is, do you think Spanish language skills are important to win Latino voters in the future?
Spent a lot of time on this, and this is a big fight. Great question, whoever asked it. You get extra points. Let me ask the audience a question, if I could. What percentage do you think of Latinos prefer their news in Spanish? What percent? Any guesses?
12%.
12? Higher or lower? 40%. 35? It's about 17%. So any poll that has more than 17% is not a credible poll. In fact, and I talk about this at length in the book, a lot of partisan Democrats will oversample Spanish language speakers because it gives them a much more skewed issue set that benefits their clients. And even though it's not accurate, it makes people in the party happy. And both parties do that, unfortunately. So no, Spanish language with Latinos is not a very significant part of the electorate anyway. The population is very different, but in both, it's shrinking, and it's shrinking dramatically. And there's a demographic reason for that too. If I can bore everybody, I know we got some questions, but let me bore everybody with a little bit more data. The peak of immigration from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s stopped at about the year 2000, just as the engine of capitalism was melting down. The economy there was no market for a lot of the industries and employees that were coming through both legal and illegal means. There has been a lull in our immigration up until Biden took office in 2020, 2021, whatever, 2021. So there's a 14-year lag, lull, a decline. Despite what Fox says, Fox News, there has been a decline in immigration. And that has created a real problem for the Univisions and Telemundos of the world because their market is shrinking. It's collapsing. It's falling apart. I don't know if you guys remember the scuttlebutt about Trump doing the interview on Univision and everyone's going, oh my God, are they turning right wing? No, they're just desperately trying to find market somewhere because their audience is collapsing. And that narrative, that Spanish-speaking immigrant narrative, that stereotype is also very tightly part of what the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party's narrative is. That's the issues that they drive. The problem is that shrinks as a share of the Latino electorate, so does the efficacy of the message.
This question is about the gender gap within Latino voters and asking about the shift of Latino men. And maybe you can kind of explain the kind of gender forces that work within this electorate.
It's a great question. Actually, this is one of the most fascinating things about what's happening. I wanted to write a whole book on this, but I thought it was probably better done by a Latina to write it herself. We have the largest gender gap of any race or ethnic group in the country. Our women vote more for the Democrats, men vote more for Republicans. I believe it's very closely correlates to the education divide because our women go to college at much higher rates than our men do. And so their political opinions are changing and manifesting very differently. We also, as a community, elect women to office at much greater rates than any other race or ethnicity. And anybody who understands Latino culture, there's the stereotype of machismo, and I guess they call that toxic masculinity here in the States. But machismo is really kind of it's a negative stereotype that doesn't have much grounding or evidence behind it. And I try to talk about it in the soft, qualitative ways with, the Virgin Mary and La Malinche and other iconic cultural figures that drive our perspective as Latinos. But where it can be quantified is in actual elections, where we actually choose who we're going to vote for. And Latinos, even California, for example, the legislature, there are more women, Hispanic women, than Hispanic men. Texas even is at about 45-55 benefiting men. But as I point out in the book, Hispanic women, Hispanics in one generation have accomplished what white women have not been able to accomplish since suffrage, which is basically parity, gender parity in elected office.
This question is about voter participation. What are some ways in which Latino voters can be encouraged or increased participation for the general election and really for all cycles? There's
two. The first is start talking to them about the issues that they have been screaming that they want to hear about for 30 years. In every poll that I've looked at, and I've probably looked at more political polls of Latinos than anybody in the country, the Latinos are saying it's jobs, the economy, affordability issues, and yet the messaging that comes out from both parties overwhelmingly is about immigration. It's about a racial or ethnic component to try to compel. And that's how strong I think the need is for people who are not Hispanic, or frankly that are white, to impose a racial lens on non-white people. It's like there's just innate need to say, well, if they're not white, then there's some level of aggrieved, there's some level of oppressed, there's some level of distinction. And I think there's probably a good reason for that with black voters, but we're not black voters. And that, I think, is one of the real challenges that both parties face. That's the first thing I would say. The second, again, and this is the data guy in me, there's a very strong correlation between those who do not vote and those who are poor. And it doesn't matter if you're black in the Deep South or white in Appalachia or Latino in East Los Angeles. If you're poor, you don't vote. And we have a poverty problem in California. And we don't talk about it nearly enough because the dominant party definitely does not want to talk about it. But there's a massive problem which is becoming, because of the housing affordability, an intergenerational problem. And if you're pro-democracy, but you're not pro-economy, at some point those are going to run square into one another. If you're not creating a healthy economy for working class people and a ladder for economic opportunity, your democracy is going to come apart. It will fall apart because what you're creating is a pyramid of fewer and fewer people at the top of the pyramid of one race and ethnicity, and more people in poverty of a different race and ethnicity. And that story has never ended well in the course of human history, ever. And that's what that's California, by the way. One of the most segregated states in the Union, California, because of housing. I can tell you what race and ethnicity and gender you are, certainly your income level, probably your college education level by your zip code in California. One of the most segregated states in America because we don't build enough housing for our people by intent. We've chosen this society.
Here's an author question. During your research for this book, anything that surprised or shocked you?
Yeah, you know what surprised me the most is that the book was optimistic. Yeah, truly. I never, like in 30 years of doing this, I was just always doom and gloom. That's probably because I work in politics. But as I was writing this and I was coming to these different conclusions and trying to be like more forward thinking of where this was going, all of the indicators, I believe, of what ails American society. And look, since with the Lincoln Project, talk a lot with the George Conways, I talk a lot with the campaign finance reform people, talk a lot with the electoral college people and all these people talking about the safeguards for democracy. But as George has taught me very astutely, there is no constitution in this country that can be written, none, if the people don't want it. You can't protect it. And we live in a society right now where those that are 65 years and older, who are amongst the most privileged generation this great nation has ever produced, the beneficiaries of what has largely been a time of peace, of global US hegemony, and yet they have the most negative views of this country of any generation polled in the history of modern polling techniques. And at the same time, we have this emergence of a younger, poorer, browner, somewhat more recently migrated community that has the highest testing levels of confidence and optimism and hope and trust in our institutions and in the basic mythology of the American dream. And as I say in the book, it's a foot race between these two demographics. It's who can, I used to always worry and struggle as an undergrad when I first started doing this research in the early 90s, is can Latinos, this non-Western European people with the culture that we have, can we really take over the reins of power and influence in this United States of America, which in many ways represents the apex of Western thought? It's like the apex of Protestantism. You couldn't create a better, more elegant solution if you were trying to say, what would these folks do? How would they create a government? Mexicans could never come up with this, right? And I don't mean that as a bad sign. That's culturally not the way that we perceive the world. So can they be stewards of it? And the answer is screaming, not only can they be, but I don't know if it can exist without them, without us. And that's the cultural reinforcement, that cultural change, that refreshing of the basic mythology and hope in America, that Reagan City on a Hill speech. That belief in our ideas, whether they manifest or not, that this belief in the mythology is required. Immigration is required, not just for economics. The immigrant is actually the best hope for the future because they, by definition, come here believing that this is a better place than where they came from. We need that. This experiment doesn't continue without that. And hell, if we're not seeing it on full display right now in America in 2024.
You come back to that a lot in the book, optimism as this kind of unifying principle for Latino voters. And you have this story in there of when you're working on George Bush's 2000 campaign, setting up this event at the Republican convention.
Yeah.
Really built around that idea, right, of an optimistic
Nuevo dia, new day.
So we have the RNC coming up next week. Is there optimism there? Like, where's the optimistic message coming from the Republican Party? Is that the vice president's job, whoever Trump picks in the next week?
I will be heading to Mexico Friday morning for a week. True. That's not the vision of conservatism. I shouldn't say that. That's not the vision of republicanism anymore. The idea, and I love this because, Make America Great Again was not Trump. That was Reagan. It was taken by Stone, Roger Stone, and refabricated for Donald Trump. But they couldn't be more different in the approach. Making America Great Again under Reagan was very aspirational. I would say that the emphasis was on the great under Reagan. Under Trump, it's the again. It's very backward looking. It's very restorative. Let's go back to this mythical America that existed for our demographic because it worked for us. It worked for our tribe, even though we know it didn't work for anybody else, to the point where you've got Republicans who are literally erasing history in Florida, changing out history books, and not allowed to, by law, talk about certain things that were, history. That's a people that view themselves very much in decline. And there's a very strong correlation between those that are Republicans and that are very pessimistic about the future. So almost a direct correlation is if you don't like where America is at, you don't like what it's become, and you reject kind of the cultural changes that have happened, that the Republican Party's got a place for you.
And that's not something Marco Rubio can change.
I don't think he wants to change it. I think he did. And I was an early Marco Rubio supporter in 2016. I was with Marco. Because that's who he was. Now, he realized really quickly the party's changed. And so either I'm going to be a senator and continue my political career, or I'm going to stand by my beliefs. And he realized really quickly he'd rather be a senator. So that there's no optimism, there's no optimistic character. I think Tim Scott tries, but I think it's so obvious what he's doing that it satiates a certain need that white Republicans who have these deep-seated beliefs that says, see, we're not that, then it actually is genuine, because he'll at one time say, I've been pulled over many times and I've been blah, 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 blah. But, that's not all of America. And that's not the point. It's not all of America. It's all of America that wants to support the continuation of that paradigm is the problem. And he knows that. But again, he's taken a course he's on his own journey.
Trump University, of course?
Trump University, of course, yeah.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Our thanks to Mike Madrid, author of The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy, and the Ken and Jocelyn Broad Family Foundation for supporting tonight's event. If you would like to support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, you can visit commonwealthclub.org/events. Mike, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Guy Marzorati. Thank you and take care.
Yeah.